gospel. Peace be with you all.
And with your spirit.
The reading of the Holy Gospel according to St. Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord. Glory to you.
Be attentive. The Lord spoke this parable. The land of a rich man brought forth plentifully, and he thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops. And he said, I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, Fool, this night your soul is required of you. And the things which you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is he who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And as he said this, Jesus called out, He who has ears to hear, let him hear.
Glory to you, Lord. Glory to you. Holy Spirit will follow you. And the power of the Most High, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you.
Please be seated. Lord of Jesus Christ.
Good morning, friends.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Today the gospel reading that we read is about a parable, and typically it says that it's the parable of the rich fool. Now, for whatever reason, in the wisdom of whoever set up the gospel reading, and I mean that humbly, but for whatever reason they did not add the first 3 verses or the part that kind of leads to Jesus talking about those things. As Jesus was walking from town to town, as we know, he was healing people and giving everybody bits of wisdom and knowledge that the Holy Spirit was sharing with him. And one particular day, as he was talking about certain things, about what you need to do to look for the kingdom of heaven, this man out of the crowd asks him a question. Now the thing we must understand that even today, the priests and the bishops and everything, we often go to them and we often go to the priests and we ask them for wisdom to mediate between our marriages and mediate between different things. But even more back then, people would go to the rabbis and to the teachers to mediate between financial things and different aspects of their life. And this particular man, right before this gospel reading, asked Jesus, he says, I want you to tell my brother something, right? I want you to tell my brother he needs to split the inheritance with me, right? Obviously, for whatever the case, this man's family had died. The older brother inherited everything, and for whatever reason, he was being greedy and selfish and didn't want to share any of those things, any of the inheritance with the younger sibling. And Jesus said, why are you coming to me? Why are you asking me to be this arbitrator between you and your brother? He says, but you need to understand what you need to do is beware of covetousness, right? Coveting, right? Jesus' words specifically talk about coveting, right? Because this guy, and whoever knows what the situation was, but Jesus obviously knew, was warning this man and us about coveting. Now the thing about coveting is oftentimes, we often don't understand quite what that coveting means, right? In the Jewish understanding of the word coveting, right? When we read that in the book of Exodus, does anybody remember what the 10th commandment says? Thou shalt not covet, right? Thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's, right? Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's animals. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's, right? And what does that word coveting mean, right? That coveting, right? Before I even tell you what that coveting means, you must understand that that word covet can actually be used for good or for evil, right? That word covet, oftentimes when we hear it, means that we need to understand that things are evil. We shouldn't covet things, right? And what Jesus is talking about, when Solomon's talking about, right? We go back again to the wisdom of Solomon. Solomon says what? The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, right? The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. And Solomon talks about everything about Solomon, and when he is talking about his wisdom and his wanting to desire wisdom, Solomon is actually almost, right, coveting wisdom. He's wanting wisdom. He wants more and more wisdom for him to be able to understand God, right? But as we know, the ill-fated story of Solomon, right? He not only coveted God, but he also coveted a lot more. That's how he ended up with 1,000 women in his life, right? I don't know about you. One wife is hard. 1,000? That's even harder. Goes beyond without saying, right? 700 wives and 300 concubines, or vice versa, whatever the way is, but 1,000 people, right? And because of that, Solomon turned away from his thinking, his own thinking, to strive to make his wives happy, right? To please these women that were brought into his life. So we need to understand that word is covet. Bless you. We need to understand that word coveting, right? What Jesus is talking about is referring back to what Exodus is talking about, when God gave the 10 commandments for the people. Now, why is this particular commandment number 10? Now, if you're giving a series of rules, right, a series of commandments to people to govern themselves by, some of them really make sense, right? Thou shalt not murder. Obviously, don't kill anybody else. Thou shalt not steal. Don't steal what other people have. Thou shalt not lie. Don't lie about things, right? Honor your father and mother. But this one particular one, thou shalt not covet, is the final one in the sequence of the final 10. And now you understand is that 10th commandment echoes back throughout all the commandments, right? Because where your desire is, where your heart is, Jesus says at the end of this parable, right? There your heart is, where your treasure is stored, there your heart will be, right? Now, as we're storing up treasures, as we're storing up things in our lives, oftentimes we look at different people, and I guarantee we've all heard a story or even witnessed it, when somebody in their life lives all their entire life, and all they do is live a meager life, and they live over and over and over again to get to their next dollar, to store up, to store, to save. And guess what? As Jesus says in this parable, when you die, right, you can't take any of it with you. And oftentimes, the children get a hold of the inheritance that was given to them, right? And because they don't have the value that the parents had, because they don't have the value that the father has, they end up squandering every bit of that money in a short bit of time. Because they were not the ones that have to fight for that money. They were not the ones that have to fight to keep that money and store it up. But a lot of times people, husbands and wives, when they go out into the workforce, their whole driving force is to covet more and more money, right? And do whatever it takes to get more money. And Jesus today, in the parable, he talks about this man, right? A man whose example that we have, right? He says that this man, particular year, right? This man had an abundance of crops, right? More than normal. And this man, who does he talk to? Did anybody hear who he talks to? Himself. Right? Self. He's talking to himself. What am I going to do? Oh, my soul, what am I going to do? I have all of this, and yet I have a lot more. I know what I'll do, he says to himself. I'm going to tear down every single one of my barns and build it bigger, so that way I can hoard even more. What is he going to do the next year if it happens again? Tear down the barns again and do it again? Right? Now, as Jesus is talking about this man, again, he's talking about coveting. Now, one could argue the fact, is this man coveting his own material? Is this man coveting his own livelihood? Well, the one thing I understand, and the one thing that we all need to understand, is the last year or so, we've heard words like socialism and communism, and even the other words that we go along with distributing the wealth, right? But as far as I know, and you can probably change my mind if you think you can, that people who are using those words, never is enough what they get. Nothing is ever enough for people who want more, right? Nothing is ever enough for the people who want more, because they do not understand, right? When I covet something, it's because I want something that somebody else has. Now, how does this man, leading up to what Jesus is talking to, coveting, right? Who does that harvest belong to in the first place? God, right? Our church, right? There is a organization in a lot of the churches called the Theotokos, right? Friends of the poor. It's usually a group of the women of the church, right? Those women usually are the ones that distribute things for the poor. But a lot of times in a lot of these affluent Greek churches, the Theotokos has thousands and thousands of dollars. And I'm not talking $2,000 or $3,000. I'm talking $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 in their account, right? And not only do they have that much money in their account, they are so tight-fisted with that money that it just continues to grow. But the very word, Theotokos, right, speaks to itself, friend of the poor. Should that account have $1 in it? Should that account have 50 cents in it? When we give to the church, right, who is the church? Christ is the church. Christ is the one, when we donate to St. Nectarios, we're not donating to St. Nectarios, we're donating to Christ himself. And whenever we have an abundance of what we have in our lives, we are supposed to give that abundance away to other people. That man was coveting what he could have given to the poor. That man was coveting what he could have given to the people down here on 98. That man was saying to himself, I want more. And I'm not giving any of it to you, God, because I am having a conversation with myself. The conversation I'm having is to make sure that I understand what I want, and I will make sure that God is pushed out of my life. And what does Jesus say? What does God say to this man? Right? Fool! That's a powerful word. God's talking to him. Fool! Your life is required of you today. Right? That word fool, that understanding of that word fool, is the exact opposite of what Solomon was talking about in the Wisdom of Solomon. It's the exact opposite what he was talking about when he said that the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. Now, God is telling this man, you fool, you're not fearing me. You're not understanding who I am. You're not understanding what it is that I have brought into your life for not only your blessing, so that way you can bless a numerous amount of people. And that's the understanding that we need to have. Because truthfully, we as Orthodox Christians, we as Christians, period, are not supposed to even probably have bank accounts. Because when we store in a bank account, what do we say? It's a nest egg. For what? You can't take it with you. Once you're gone, it's gone. We have bank accounts and we have saving accounts and all these things. And I understand people saving for the future, but you know what? The enemy has brought into our existence a way for us to covet without even knowing that we're coveting. Because we have so much fear about what lies in the future that we are constantly striving to put just a little bit more away. I'm going to store my egg, right, nest egg, the thing that I'm holding back for a rainy day, typically is usually a lot more than what you give to the church. And then, guess what happens? You hear the same word, fool. Today, your life is required of you. They are calling, and God's not saying, I am calling you into life. They are calling into life. The world is calling you. They are calling you into the world, into this life. And you are to now focus on what's most important. Typically, when we get married with our spouses, it's the same thing that happens for the destruction of our churches. Because we want all the focus placed on ourselves. We want the focus placed on us. Right? No matter what we do in our lives, the bridegroom, Jesus Christ, he never falters and never changes who he is. No matter what we do, no matter what we say, no matter sins that we do, as long as we turn to him and we are repentant of the things that we do, as long as we begin to learn what we are doing and get closer to God, we will begin to understand what it means to have the fear of the Lord, because that is the beginning of wisdom. And we're not supposed to look at anybody else and covet anything that they have. And that's how it always ends up. When you covet somebody's life, you end up murdering them. When you covet somebody's money, you end up robbing them. And when you covet somebody's spouse, you end up having an affair. Because what God has given you is just not enough. And I got to tear down what we have in order for us to build bigger barns. Right? And at the end, it always ends up empty anyway. It always ends up in a way. Asher's walking around. Let him walk a little bit. He's okay. Now you're shy? I thought you wanted to come up here with me. No? The beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. And we must draw closer and closer to God in order to understand who he truly is. In order for us to be able to learn who God is, we need to spend time with him. And we need to covet our love for him. We need to covet that time that we have for him and begin to strive to love him more and more in our lives. We need to have more and more of his joy in our life, his understanding, his righteousness, and his purity in our lives. Because as we begin to emulate Jesus Christ in our lives, we begin to teach others how to emulate us in their lives, and ultimately they will see who Jesus Christ is through us. That is our responsibility as parents, to teach our children how it is and what it means to fear the Lord, in order for the Lord to instill the wisdom in them. As I told a few of you this morning, and I've shared with you earlier, as I pray for everybody, I no longer just pray, but now I have learned to intercede. And I'm trying to intercede, going to God with my fervent prayer, as meager and as humble as it is, and as probably as bad as it is, that I go to the Lord for each and every one of you, for God to give you the wisdom to fear the Lord himself and to draw closer to him. Pray for us. Everybody please pray for each other. Everybody please pray and store up those treasures in heaven, so that way when we glorify the Lord, we are looking for him and his glory in order for us to serve him more effectively. When you have a business, as I've shared with other people, you glorify the Lord. You serve the people that you work for. When you're married, you glorify the Lord. You serve not only your wife, but you need to get in your mind that you're also serving your children. You are supposed to have a servant's heart when you serve the people of the church. The church is Christ, and Christ is the people of God. Let us glorify and praise the name of the Lord today and worship him with all of our heart.
Amen. Amen.
Let us all say with our whole soul and our whole